welcome to Researcher Revealed, the podcast where we go behind just the name that's listed on the paper or conference proceedings to get to know a little bit more about the researcher behind the research that you're reading about. This is our 10th episode. I can't believe it already, into the double digits now. And on this week's episode, we have a respiratory physiotherapist who will be joining us to share all about her research journey. I hope you enjoy. On today's episode, we have the lovely Ruth Barker, who's a respiratory physiotherapist, joining us. Ruth, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, yeah, so my name's Ruth Barker. As said, I'm a respiratory physio by profession. Coming to this with a bit of a researcher head on, having done a clinical academic research fellowship in the past, and with a bit of a real world evaluation head on, now sitting in a Health Innovation Network and doing a role related to kind of implementation science, real world implementation of innovation and adoption, and very much with that clinical hat still on at the same time.
Oh, that sounds interesting. I cannot wait to get into that real world and implementation bits and pieces. So for everybody who's out there, you guys are probably all well used to this, but Ruth, I'm not sure whether or not you're prepared or not. But before we get into the guts of our podcast, just to get to know you a little bit better and to kind of break the ice per se, we have a rapid 11 here on Researcher Revealed. So what that means is I'm going to ask you 11 questions, quick and easy. Just tell me your answer and we'll go from there. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, are you a Windows or Mac?
Windows.
Windows. Are you a tea or a coffee?
Tea.
Oh, yes. Another one for the tea.
Yeah, got to be preferably Yorkshire tea as well, not just tea.
Oh, so
Yorkshire
like
tea.
So you're definitely like only like a black tea versus like herbal infusions or anything like that?
Yeah, just a black
And
tea, but
only
a
Yorkshire?
but preferably Yorkshire tea. Yeah.
No. Yorkshire Gold or New York's normal?
Yorkshire normal. I don't know. Is it Yorkshire Gold? Don't know, but Yorkshire normal is definitely the one.
Perfect. Excellent. When you're writing, do you prefer music or some sort of sound or silence?
Dead silence.
Silence. Oh, you're a rare bird. Not many people have said that.
Dead
Interesting.
silence.
And where do you tend to work? Home or in an office somewhere?
Hybrid, bit of both.
Nice. At what time of day are you most productive? It doesn't have to be down to the minute, just generically, morning, evening.
Like early morning, like 5 till 9, and then after that it's all downhill.
You're one of those like crazy early birds. I've been like congratulating myself because for about like the last 6 months now, I've managed to transition to being up and out by 6 a.m. and get a workout in before I hit the desk. And I'm like, oh, go me. And now here you are blowing up my achievement out the window.
Yeah, but I'm in bed by like 9 p.m. So yeah, it swings and roundabouts, isn't it?
It's like, I don't know if you've follow or heard about him, but there's this through my husband, there's this guy in America called Jocko or Yoko Wilnick. Anyway, he's like ex-military, blah blah blah, American military, and Jocko, that's his name. And he's like up and working out at like 4 o'clock in the morning, but he's very quiet about what time he goes to bed.
It's probably about 8 or 9 p.m.
Probably.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
5 a.m. Whew, something to achieve, something to go for. Right. This is my favorite one because the reactions that I tend to get. What is your favorite referencing software or management system?
I use EndNote.
Okay.
But I don't know if it's my favorite. It's just the one I've always used and have not managed to like brace the transfer over to another system, basically.
So if it's not your favorite, you're just kind of stuck with it because there's no such thing as well, I kind of agree with that, but anyway. Yeah. What about favorite data visualization tool? So when it comes to like making figures, flowcharts, graphs, things like that.
So would have said previously Canva, but I've started using Visio recently and actually quite like that. That's like the Microsoft version.
Oh, and is it different than PowerPoint?
Yeah, different to PowerPoint. It's got lots of like good functionality. Yeah, so that's why I've started using recently.
Visio, I might have to look into that because I never bothered with Canva because I would get frustrated with it because having only a free membership to it because I'm too cheap, don't have enough money to buy the paid one. It was just so restrictive. I was always like running into like pay barriers. So Visio, might have to look into that.
Yeah.
Interesting. Top tip. Right. Favorite desk snack.
Oh, I love food. Just any snack I'll take. But actually, if I'm going to take my favourite snack is, you get those little packets of like Scotch pancakes that you're meant to toast. I just eat a pack of 6 just because they're just really nice. Sitting at a desk, untoasted. They're my favourite, probably desk snack.
You would get along so well in Norway because they eat pancakes like it's going out of style.
Yeah.
When I was there at Christmas, I went to a Christmas market and they actually, which if you like a pancake, you have to try this because it'll be life-changing for you. So they take crispy bacon and like chop it up in small bits. And then they put that in a pancake.
Oh, like an omelette with something in, but it's a pancake with something in, like, but not blueberries, like nice.
Yeah, like savory. So imagine that with like maple syrup. So then you get the sweet and salty and the cake all at the same time. Yeah, it's life-changing.
Yeah, I might genuinely have to try that.
Not sure if I'm influencing you for good or evil at this point, but
Yeah, no, definitely good. Definitely good.
Oh, right. Excellent. When it comes to like planning and organizing, so whether that's like your calendar or like a project, do you tend to use like pen and paper or are you digital only?
Hybrid. I have online calendar, online tasks, online notes, but I also like a paper diary, just because I just have this thing that if all goes down, I know sort of what I'm meant to be doing.
That is a good shout. Now I'm starting to have a bit of anxiety about the fact mine's all electronic. When it comes to what I'm supposed to be doing and when, if like I lost Outlook, I would be just wandering around going, where am I?
Yeah, that's what sort of stresses me a little. So yeah, now I have like the high level stuff in a paper diary and everything else is in Outlook.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Second to last question. What book are you currently reading?
Oh, it's a bit of a geeky book.
Okay.
It's on my desk. I haven't finished yet, but it was actually recommended by somebody, and it's actually been really great. Oh, you can't see that. I'll read it. It's called Shifting the Dials: A New Approach for Success in Work and Life. It's a bit geeky, but actually, it's really making me really think. So it's good. It's really good.
Very interesting. What I'll probably ask you to do in an email after this is over, if you can send me the title and author of that, because I started trying to like keep track of like different books and stuff that people are doing. I put them in the description of the episode if you're listening out there. So if you think that book sounded interesting, you can check it out. But I also have visions of someday actually creating a website for this podcast and having like an electronic bookshelf of what all the researchers who I have on the podcast are reading come in.
Nice. Yeah.
Then you can pull it out. But anyway, that's future Rosalind's problem. Last question is, who is a researcher that you admire?
Am I allowed a couple?
Sure. There's very few rules here.
Yeah. So I'm not going to name any names, but basically there's like 3 people who I really like working with.
Okay.
Different reasons. One of them's a methodologist and gets me like really thinking about like just thinking about like not just inherently doing the same thing for the sake of doing it, and actually really thinking about application and thinking about the why of the way you do things. The other is somebody who just makes me think about the rationale for everything. So like not necessarily methods, but like the why behind doing a project, like what's the
Okay.
point, and then making it so that you really hone in and focus. So that's the other
Okay.
person. And then the third person I really like for totally different reasons, because they're super, super pragmatic. So they're really good at problem
Ooh.
solving. So they sort of go, just take a step back. Like, you've gone too insular, too focused. Actually, this is how you then, this, you know, you maybe need to take a step back. You can't see the wood for the, you know, you can't see the wood for the trees. Like, so like, they're my kind of three people that I just have really good conversations with.
I was going to say, that sounds like quite the power trio, the
Yeah.
practical, the how, and the why. I mean,
Yeah.
what else do you need? If you
Yeah,
have that
exactly.
around you, you are minted.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
That's really
So
cool.
not one, but like everybody brings something to the table. So like my go-to people, I'll be like, can I just drop you an email?
I know. So good. It's such an important part of research, and I think it's definitely a skill that I don't know about you and your training. We'll get into that in a minute, but my training, they would talk about in these really vague terms, but when it came down to like the how to, it was kind of like, good luck to you, figure it out. And for me, one of those things that was really crucial, and I think for me now in this postdoc period that I'm relying on so much, is those networks that you build,
Yeah.
and those that it's more than just like, ooh, I know somebody, but it's that relationship that you continue to like feed and maintain. And I think for me, it goes back to one of the reasons why I started this podcast is I learned how to do that, not because of research or my research training. I listened to entrepreneurial podcasts.
Yeah.
And I picked up, and because I picked up skills from there. So I'm hoping that this will help to start to fill that gap within the world of research, by sharing everybody's journey and like top tips and hints of how to do research successfully, especially as a clinician. So that brings us back now nicely to, in your introduction of yourself, you kept talking about this clinical head. So I know you, so I know that you're a respiratory physiotherapist. So thinking back, like way back in the beginning of all of this journey for you to become a researcher, what was it as a clinician that made you go, that research thing looks cool, I want to give it a stab?
I think my first manager would probably call me like just curious, like
Okay.
always asking a question, always wondering why, always wanting to do a little bit more, just because like I couldn't explain like why that was I was interested in that. I just was
Okay.
interested. And like, I can get excited about anything. So when I was doing like my rotations, I'd be like, oh, I could do an in-service presentation on this because it's interesting. So I just had that kind of questioning head. So for me,
Okay.
research felt like a fairly natural step, because that's what you do inherently with research, is sort of ask questions. So it kind of gave me a space to legitimately do that and not just be like the annoying person that's always asking questions. It was kind of welcomed in that world. Whereas like I think sometimes in the clinical world, it's much harder because there's like much more fixed rules, or there's like established pathways. Whereas in research, people are always asking questions. So it gave me like a space to be like not annoyingly curious, but like interested curious. And that was like welcomed. But equally kind of I never wanted those questions to just be like abstract questions. They should always be back to kind of the purpose, or the reason I was there in the first place. So yeah, that was kind of how I kind of got a bit interested, I guess, because it gave me a space to ask questions legitimately and not feel like I was just being annoying.
I love that. That's such a beautiful way of putting it. Like that it's research is because I think a lot of within the nursing world, which is very different than the physiotherapy world, within the nursing world, I find there's a lot more not necessarily acceptance of evidence-based, but there's definitely much less curiosity that is invoked within nursing. And instead, I find like nurses who are in research, they are the ones who are like, but why? But why? And they really have to encourage and foster that curiosity. So it's really interesting to hear that that was just something that naturally occurred in you, and that the best way for you to stop annoying people was to go into the
Yeah.
world of research. I'm sure you weren't as annoying as what you think you were.
Yeah.
So that is what pushed you into research. So then what did that push into research look like for you? Like how did that come to be?
Yes, I feel like I was really lucky. That same manager that I talked about before, I was always curious, always asking questions. She just really encouraged that of me. She never tried to sort of say like, no, don't let your head go there. She was just really happy for me to be curious.
Nice.
So that was really good. And so yeah, so like the step for me was kind of starting to ask questions and do the stuff that we can do within the roles that we have as clinicians. So like the service evaluation work, the quality improvement projects. Like to me, that's like it's a bit like a gateway drug into research. Like I was given basically permission to do those projects and really, yeah, like I was given permission to
Gateway
do that.
drug.
Yeah, and then I kind of just, I think because I was just interested and I wanted to learn, I went away and learned about different methods and how to analyze data and how to do different things that I needed to be able to do the projects I wanted to do. So I sort of problem solved along the way. And then I ended up, because I was really interested, I don't even know where I saw it, that the NIHR masses what predated the PCAFs. And I sort of said, oh, what, do you know what, actually, I'd really be interested in applying for one of these. At the time, I had genuinely no idea how competitive they were to get. I just was like, they sound really interesting. Just thought it was like applying for anything else. And was successful and then did an MRes. And then came back into clinical practice after my MRes for that year. And the trust I was at was just was still really open to the idea of me wanting to do research and be embed research. So they kind of gave me time within that role, and we didn't know what to call it, so we just called it like a therapies research facilitator type role. And so it was like
Wow.
it was time to support other people to think about projects, support people and signpost people into projects, or just like quality improvement projects or service evaluation work. So for me, it was just because the people around me allowed me to think that way and they didn't have to actively nurture me. They just gave me the space to I guess grow, which was like the biggest thing, I think. And then it sort of just went from there, really.
That's such an interesting idea of actually just because I think sometimes in other conversations that I've had, not necessarily on this podcast, but in my roles that I've had, is that a lot of managers actually are really self-conscious because they're like, oh, Fred's an imaginary person, just for everybody out there listening. I'm not talking about a real Fred. This Fred has come to me and they said, I really want to be involved in research. And managers have said, that they feel really bad because they don't have that expertise. They don't have the experience. They don't know how to signpost people. And for you, in your experience, it was actually just your manager being, all right, crazy, off you go. And
Yeah.
allowing you to do that,
Yeah.
that then allowed you to flourish, to do this MRes. And then they actually gave you even more space when you finished that, that then allowed you to help and build capacity for others around audit and quality and improvement work. Did you at that point ever think about or get approached by like the trust at the time where you were working, their research delivery team, and be like, hey, do you want to do like this big clinical study, or was that not really a part of it?
So the trust I was at the time, and I can't speak for where the R&D department is now, so the research delivery team is now, but there was kind of no connection between therapies and R&D and research delivery at the time. It was all research nurses that were employed, like we're talking 2014, so like 10 years ago. So it's all research nursing, delivered research. We didn't have any, I guess, therapies research. All of the PIs and CIs were all medics. So actually from a research delivery point of view, there wasn't much contact. But again, that same manager, she, so I said, oh, I'm really interested into work, see how R&D works. So she'd be like, oh, contact the R&D manager and see if you can go to their monthly meetings and just go and hear about the projects. So there wasn't really any connection with therapy. So research delivery, in terms of, I guess, that as a trajectory into research, probably wasn't available at the District General Hospital that I was at. But equally, I think if I'd probably said that was the avenue I wanted to go down instead of my own hypothesis-driven research, would there have been a blanket no? I don't think there would have been. I think it just probably wasn't where my head went as a clinician. But I think that's probably changed over time. I think there's much more allied health professionals now in research delivery than there probably was 10 years ago.
I think slowly, but I think it's similar to how you described your journey into doing your own hypothesis-driven research, which I love that term, and I'm going to steal it. It is very individually driven, so there is still like the occasional job application, advert that you see come out within research delivery. It'll be a research practitioner instead of like a research nurse, but they still, I'd say a lot of places are still more like limiting it to nurses only, which again, there's so many other research studies out there that would really benefit from allied health professionals. So, but I think you're right. I think it's starting to change. And I think some of the things that nationally the NIHR are doing, both to encourage more big research projects that are being driven by non-medics. I think in the years to come, it'll get exponential. Fingers crossed.
I say that, but actually my next role after working at that DGH was in, I guess, technically research delivery. I was employed as a research physio, but working alongside, very much embedded in a clinical team. So it was I guess I wouldn't say that sat in R&D, that sat very specifically next to a research team that was supporting a clinical team with a very specific interest. And again, they were all grants that were applied for. So they weren't kind of coming down as like commercial studies that we were a site for. They were we were going, oh, there's a call out for that. Should we submit something? Or that's, should we apply to this charity for funding for this project? So we were involved from the grant writing stage to the ethics, to the setup, to the delivery, to the kind of closed and analysis and then dissemination. So it was slightly different probably to what conventional research delivery roles look like, sort of.
Depends on where you are and what your team looks like, but a lot quite similar. Okay, so finish your master's, you're got this innovative role that they're allowing you to spread the gateway drug of clinical audits and quality improvement work. So, and then you were kind of dabbling in this semi-research delivery, which still actually sounds more like you were more part of a research group that was developing their own program of research rather than commercially driven or industry driven. So then what happened after that?
So I went into a research physio role at a tertiary hospital, so moved trusts, because partly what drove that thought process for me was I'd been and done an MRes and got all of this information, was using it to kind of signpost people, but I also quite quickly realised I didn't have anybody within that trust who had done what I was looking to try and do, and I didn't have anybody to kind of role model or kind of really see where I could go with it. So I ended up moving to a trust where people were doing that, where I just could see where I could go with it, and just knew there was the right support in place to be able to take the next steps. And so then, yeah, was in a research physio role, working alongside a clinical service, doing kind of clinical delivery, and then the kind of the very clinical assessments for the studies that we were delivering. So like all like we basically tagged on to a clinical assessment, and so we did the full clinical assessment to be able to do the extra couple of research assessments. And then applied for an NIHR Clinical Doctoral Research Fellowship in that role, and then so worked as kind of, I guess, a research fellow within that clinical research team for obviously the duration, that 3-year duration of my fellowship, and then then into where I kind of am now. But yeah, that was kind of the next step, was kind of into somewhere where could really support me grow, kind of in the back of my head thinking eventually I can then use that for the greater good, because I can take it back to somewhere else and use it and apply it. Whereas like I kind of felt like I'd kind of learned a little bit, but there was so much, like the tip of the iceberg, but there was all of this stuff that I just couldn't learn just through like osmosis of listening to things online or reading stuff. Like it was kind of the applied doing. So yeah, that was where I went after that.
Okay, so your actual PhD, what was it on?
So it was on, so the title was Improving Access and Uptake to Pulmonary Rehab Following Acute Exacerbations of COPD. So a mixed methods program of research involving basically a co-design project, systematic review, feasibility trial, and testing of another intervention which was intended to improve the uptake of rehab, and then kind of, I guess, like pulling that together into the kind of, I guess, the conclusion of kind of where that had all kind of led in terms of moving us forward to be a better understand what opportunities were out there to get patients into pulmonary rehab.
Okay, so again, pulling that apart a little bit. So was pulmonary rehabilitation sort of like in your training as a physiotherapist, was that really like your passion and your drive, or was that again something that you were like, oh, I wonder, or a combination?
A bit of both. So really interested in respiratory, and my MRes project was in oxygen post-acute exacerbation. So I guess my heart lies in post-exacerbation management and respiratory physio, and the components, I guess, of care with kind of how people are managed. Like in COPD, there's kind of like people are well and then they become unwell, and then kind of they never quite get back to being as well as they were before they run well. So that every time they have a trough, their peak is never quite as high. And so I guess for me, it's just about limiting how much that exacerbation affects the person so they can live as healthily and as well as they can, with as much quality as they can around having exacerbations, which is the nature of, I guess, the condition. So yeah, it was about COPD and about management of exacerbations, and pulmonary rehab is kind of a cornerstone in the management of acute exacerbations of COPD. So it kind of makes sense when there's problems in terms of getting people to even access a program, and then once they kind of get into a rehab program, getting them to kind of take it up and then continue to completion of the program and then maintain. So yeah, just for me, it just made kind of, I guess, fairly inherent sense to try and unpick that a little bit. So yeah, a bit of both, like respiratory, COPD management, post-exacerbation, and then rehab being the focus of that program of work.
Okay, so was that that improving access to the pulmonary rehab for this patient population of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD patients, was that something that you were seeing happen a lot in your own clinical practice, or were you more acute and you were like, I'm sending these people off and they're going to get better, and then you'd see them again, you know, that revolving door? So which side of the street were you on, more the revolving door side, or trying to get people, you know, you had the rehabilitation course set up and you were sitting there going, How come only one person has joined? Because I know there was 10 referred. So just out of curiosity.
So I had a really interesting role. So I sat on both sides. So
Oh, wow.
I were the rehab so the research team was embedded within the pulmonary rehab service. But because I came from an acute background, I had a honorary contract with the local acute trust. So I supported their integrated respiratory service doing admission avoidance and early supported discharge for their COPD patients. So we would assess people in A&E coming in with an exacerbation. Could we take them home and manage them at home? Could we, or if they were in hospital, could we reduce the length of time they were in hospital and support some of their medical management at home if they were stable enough to get them home? And then as part of that process, there's something called the COPD discharge bundle, and there's key elements that you should do as best practice when someone exacerbates with COPD, basically to give them the best opportunity to kind of get well after an exacerbation. One of them is pulmonary rehab. So we would be talking to people about rehab when they were discharged, whilst also being very connected with the rehab service. So I knew, for example, when I was referring people, were they coming through and being seen within the rehab team? Were they actually saying yes to me in hospital, but actually not? When someone from the rehab team was ringing up saying, do you want to come? They were like, oh no, I don't want to go. So I could see that both sides. And so doing the clinical assessments for the rehab team, alongside doing then as I say, the additional rehab studies had additional assessments tagged on. So we were doing the clinical assessments. I had people who'd say, Ruth, I see, because I also worked within the integrated respiratory team, I supported one of the outpatient respiratory clinics.
Okay.
So people would come through like referrals for like kind of a differential diagnosis in the respiratory clinic. So they'd see me getting new diagnoses. Then if they came into hospital having just been diagnosed with COPD, then they'd see me in hospital and then they'd see me at rehab. So they'd be like, we see you everywhere. So I had really interesting roles. I had an opportunity to see things from both sides. And try things out from both sides, I guess, because like the intervention itself that we co-designed in my PhD program of work was looking at the delivery of rehab and how could we think about the delivery of rehab to make it more attractive for people once they'd been referred to kind of get through the program and stay on the program. Whereas another intervention that we tested was actually at the point of being discharged and being offered rehab, could we get more people to be referred? So they were targeting different parts of the pathway. One of them was about increasing referral rates. One of them was about getting people to take it up and stay in the program. So the interventions were testing different parts of the clinical pathway, I guess.
Oh, that's fascinating. But what a monster of a PhD. Good grief.
Yeah, it was it's quite bulky.
That sounds fascinating. So, without getting too into your PhD, is your PhD, did you do that with a publication model or with the more traditional monograph model?
Just more traditional monograph.
More traditional. And is that available online for if somebody was really keen and wanted to read your very bulky PhD, they could go and download it?
Yeah, it's on the Imperial Library Spire, one of the two.
What I might do, because it does sound like a really, like, to me, like my ears went up immediately when you said the title, because for me, I'm like, it's a different population, but I'm really interested in heart failure patients, and similar to COPD patients, they have all of these acute episodes and their line just goes from good to worse. And after a decompensation and likely hospital admission, they don't even match the same level. Like there's always a big step down. And there's a lot of discussion in the heart failure world about like self-care and how to get people to engage in it more and things like that. And unfortunately, for a lot of heart failure patients and services, they don't even have access to a heart failure specific rehabilitation program. They just have to do it independently because they got taught. Anyway, we won't go down that because then I'll get on my high horse and we'll be here all day. But I really found it interesting because similarly, I think, you know, the pathway that patients have to take in order to access a given service, in your case, rehabilitation, in heart failure case, whether that's to see a specialist or their GP or pharmacist or whatever. I think that's so often area within our healthcare services really overlooked because most services go by the, well, if they need it, they'd come ask for it. And so I find it really fascinating that's what you dialed in on, is like, how can we actually improve the access rather than just being like, let's make it all singing, all dancing. Because in a parallel vein, one of the things post heart attack that is reputed as being really hard is to get people to uptake is cardiac rehabilitation.
The uptake rates in cardiac rehab are definitely better than pulmonary rehab.
Oh wow, because that says a lot, because they are not good.
Yeah.
Wow, interesting. I didn't know that. That's fascinating. Cardiac are a bunch of superstars, and like our rates are rubbish.
Yeah, we always compare our numbers to cardiac rehab.
Wow, interesting.
Or I do anyway.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so you did your PhD monograph and you did that as an NIHR Clinical Academic Fellowship. So were you maintaining that clinical role throughout? Or because some people who I know who did the NIHR PhD fellowships, they end up sort of more being supernumerary, so they're not as involved clinically. But what was it like for you?
Yeah, same. I'd say not as involved clinically, but definitely totally connected with the clinical service at all times. I think partly just because of the way the research team was set up anyway, is it was a embedded part of the clinical service, and the fact that I was recruiting and doing a study at the acute hospital. I was then delivering care when I was going to speak to people about research studies. I was doing their discharge bundles, and I was doing assessments. So I was doing, it was all embedded within their kind of, I guess, the clinical pathway is, you know, when I'm there, you know, I'll be there and I'll be assessing patients and doing all of the usual clinical things, not just going to talk to them about the study, but, you know, auscultating, talking to them about inhalers, speaking to them about rehab, you know, asking them about, you know, have they, you know, what do they understand about self-management, and talking them through self-management. So doing their clinical care whilst having a conversation about the research study. So definitely very connected throughout the whole time, which was really nice, because I think it kept me very grounded about why I was doing it. Like is when the times when I was like, this is a lot, like quite overwhelmed with the amount of like, just like how intense the process is, just being like, oh, this is why. And it kept me very like sensible of like, the why is really obvious, just forget about the other stuff, get the stuff ticked off the list one at a time, and the to-do list will get shorter. So in theory, you hope. So that was really, I felt really closely connected to kind of clinical, I guess, the whole time. But it was really not ad hoc, but it was like there was peaks and troughs. I'd do more clinical and then I'd do less, but it was always really well closely connected.
That sounds like really sort of like the ideal sort of combination then of, you know, being able to have that contact to remind you of the why and to motivate you to keep going, especially on those hard days. But also giving you the license to, if you needed to stay away in order to get through your very long to-do list, you could do that as well. So it sounds like a really nice supportive balance. So finished your PhD in
21, mid 21. Yeah.
During COVID.
During COVID, yeah.
Lucky you.
Yeah.
So did you have to do your Viva remotely, or were you doing it in
remotely.
person?
No, remotely. Yeah.
How did you find that?
That was just weird. Like, I made myself get properly dressed up, stand up. I put like the laptop on like the kitchen like worktop so I could like properly like feel like I was like presenting. I was like, I need to get myself like in the headspace of like, so it was a bit weird. And yeah, it was a bit weird, but it was, I think I was just pleased that I'd like got to that point. Like I hadn't taken an interruption of study. I'd been able to like get written up and stuff. So like I think I felt a little bit privileged that I'd even got there. Do you know, like, so yeah, I think it was weird, but it was, you know, my assessors were really like, it was good. Like I actually quite enjoyed the Viva in the end. Yeah.
I think those of us who completed either during or just the COVID like pressures, I don't want to say panic, but you know, like when like that's sort of down, so later 2021 into 2022, where it wasn't pretty much that everybody thought everybody was going to die from it anymore. I think having gone through that during your PhD period definitely added an additional level of challenge and like in some ways like real building up your perseverance. Because it's like this huge unforeseen thing. But like for me, because I was sort of in the middle of data collection, it gave me so many great lessons as well, because it was like, when do you pause a study? How do you restart it? What do you need to consider? Like it layered in so much more than like a traditional PhD would have ever trained you. So similar to you. Although I, you know, would never wish a pandemic on anybody. I can't imagine my PhD without it.
Mine, I co-designed a model of care pre-pandemic to then the pandemic happen, and a lot of the co-designed conversations led to was initially planning a face-to-face intervention on top of, instead of people wanting anything virtual or light touch, because people didn't think that was the best way to get them through a program. And then the pandemic happened, which meant that just wasn't viable to do. And actually then I was like, okay, so I've co-designed something. I've purposefully had these conversations. Actually, there's things happening outside of this control. Like, what do you do about all of this now? So so that was really interesting. Problem solving those. So yeah, it was interesting. But no, really, as you say, so much learning about unpicking. Now I know the terms, things like unpicking complexity and you know, testing implementation and all of the things that I had to go away and think about, that I was thinking about but didn't know the processes to do that at the time, but was doing it on the hoof because I kind of had to. So,
oh wow, the things we have to be thankful for. Okay, so finished it, clinical academic, 2021. I mean, I can imagine you just stepped into a beautiful clinical academic position, right?
Well, it was so we made some life choices. And so we decided we were relocating, me and my other half, back down to where he grew up. So I was already kind of knew at that point we would be moving, and I'd be thinking about what the next steps were anyway. And had some really good conversations with some respiratory researchers down where we've ended up moving to. And there was potential opportunities to pursue there. And again, clinical services, had good conversations with clinical services. And then a role was advertised with what was an academic health science network, now is a health innovation network. for it, and there's 15 in the UK, and so I'm working at in Wessex region, at Health Innovation Wessex, in an evaluation role. So that was kind of taking, I guess, thinking about what happens in the real world when we implement something, and actually, you know, how are services using things? Is it delivering what they anticipate it will when they implement something? And so actually for me that was really interesting, because one of the things I hadn't covered in my PhD was developing a model of care and then testing the feasibility of that model of care. But actually there's nuances to that. When you take something and think about spread and adoption, something's not going to be necessarily implemented and spread in exactly the same way that it was tested in the research setting. So actually for me, this was a really, really interesting role to go and learn something that I hadn't done before. So I was just curious. Curious is probably, so I was just really curious about how you do this in a systematic, robust, I guess, really transparent way, and how you unpick those nuances about when people implement things slightly differently. Say, for example, in the same patient group, but their pathways look different, but it's the same intervention, but it's at a different point in the pathway, or it's just done slightly differently. So just going away and learning the theory behind implementation and de-implementation, and the theory behind like complexity, and just really interesting. So for me, this actually was maybe a bit of a tangent, but actually just really interesting, and actually really suited where my head was kind of going in terms of how do you use something beyond testing it in the research world. So
but I would argue actually COVID and the impact that had on your specific PhD project, it led you directly to that role that you're just describing, because I don't know, like way back in like my early days, I had this exercise psychologist who was like, he kind of planted a seed way back in the beginning of my education about like, if you were to invent a pill that cured fill in the blank illness. So for you, COPD, for me, heart failure. If taking that pill was an impossibility, what good does it do? Either because of its size, because of its side effects, because it's too expensive, like whatever that reason is. And he started at a very young age, started to make me think about, it's not just enough to create this new model of care, this new intervention, but it's about how it becomes applicable. And in my own like professional career, I always found it like so interesting that, like, for example, and I don't know if you've read it or not. Have you read the book Invisible Women?
Nope.
Okay.
Put it on my list.
Put it on your list. It's a bit of a hard read for a couple of reasons. One is there's a lot of stats in it, and two, it's slightly depressing to read, especially as a female. Anyways, in that, it highlights that same issue of what you're talking about, is like this thing was designed with this patient or this population or this pathway in mind. But like in heart failure or in most cardiology, or let's be honest, pretty much every research ever, if you have a sample that has more than 30% women, you're like a genius. And let's not even go into like the representation for people who are non-Caucasian, like, it's just not there in research. And to me, it's so interesting to see how, great example. We were, as a research nurse, I was involved in this big research study, and it was so hard to recruit people to, because the inclusion and exclusion criteria were so narrow. And it ended up being like a really impactful drug. They ended the study early, and like it went through like all the approval process really quickly. And clinically, you just start seeing like doctors giving it out like candy. And I'm going, well, Where's the evidence
Yeah.
behind that? And so you said this in the introduction, and I think it's the perfect time to start to unpick this, is that combination of implementation science together with real world evaluation. So for you, what does real world evaluation mean?
So for me, evaluation is the real in the real world is something that's happening is something that is happening naturally. So in by that I mean there's a model of care or an innovation that could be a piece of tech, it could be a digital tool, and actually what we're doing is we're supporting in our area, we're supporting people to say, okay, so this is what we currently do, this is how we want to use it, this is where we think, this is why we want to use it, we think it's going to impact patients or staff, or it's going to do this or it's going to do that, and help them work out based on either the current data that's available or maybe new data collection, how they're going to evidence that that has happened, has been, is the case. And it usually, for me, this is something that's got an evidence base already. So it's, it's got a research base. We can say it's, efficacious and it's effective and it should do this and it should do that. But actually, when you take it out of your really nice research world that's controlled and you've got your inclusion and exclusion criteria and it's been done in a set way, actually, does it, is it having the impact in that very natural setting? And it's working with the system partly for them to, we don't necessarily do the implementation, we can guide them on how they might think about processes, but we'll support them to do evaluation of that, and then help them kind of interpret that data, make decisions and recommend it, and we can then make recommendations off the data, and then do kind of lessons learned pieces around kind of, actually, was it the implementation strategy where it fell down, actually not necessarily the innovation itself, or actually did the implementation go really well, but actually the innovation didn't deliver as intended? So it's kind of unpicking the complexity that comes with the NHS, because we don't do clinical care in the nice, neat research setting that we deliver trials in, and kind of unpicking that. So for me, that's what real world evaluation is kind of understanding something that's evidence and efficacious, but actually, can we do it the same way in clinical practice, and does it work in clinical settings the way we'd kind of want it to, in that applied way? I guess that for me is, and and for me, they're not all mixed methods, but I think for me, you learn a lot by doing something mixed methods, because you learn not just the what is happening with the quantitative data, but you learn kind of the why it's happening by unpicking it with the qualitative. So for me, it's really useful getting that multiple data perspective, and quite often I think like a multiple stakeholder perspective is really helpful. So quite often implementation can fall down even if staff love something because patients don't like it, or something might fall down because actually there's a problem with actually staff's experiences of using something, even if it's really beneficial to patients. So I think, again, just unpicking that's really, really helpful.
Oh, it sounds fascinating. So a little bit of a return to your roots around your gateway drug.
Gateway drug, yeah.
Of that,
it's all about the gateway drug.
audit, but on a whole different scale now, because you've had that experience through your own PhD of driving your own hypotheses. You're now sort of getting a hold of that data and looking at it from that almost, it sounds to me more like you're looking at it from a system point of view. So on an earlier episode, I was speaking with Rhys Williams, who's a pharmacist. And he's much earlier in his research career, and he's been involved in a big research team, and he really helps around data collection and analysis of that real world. But in his head, when he's talking about real world evaluation, similar to you, where we know this treatment works, but actually we now want to look at its impact when we put it in a real population. But the work they're doing, his research group is doing, is it's much more population based rather than system based. So for you, are you looking at a combination of that population plus system, because you've got that wider mixed methods and understanding of the complexity, where for them they're just like, you know what, in the drug study run by this industry partner, they said only these people were cool enough. In clinic, we're actually giving it to all these people, and actually people that, you know, fall outside of this may have had more benefit or less benefit, whatever. So describing that real world experience of that treatment for that population.
I guess I would say, depending on what the need of the person coming to seek an independent evaluation, we would kind of have a scoping meeting, having scoping conversations. We would logic model to work out a theory of change for what they want to learn from something, and kind of what their intended use for the data is, and the understanding that they need to glean in order to. So we would tailor the evaluation question based on those scoping meetings and that kind of understanding of what the theory of change means to them, or how we've developed. And so it could be at a patient level. It could be, you know, is this improving patient outcomes in X, Y, and Z specific measures? It could be, you know, if it's a workforce related thing, is it improving staff experience? And it could be individual, it could be a team level, individual level, it could be a system level, or it could be both staff and patient perspectives, or it, you know. So I think the level depends on the need of the person, or the, you know, the requirement, request. The request that comes in. So it's quite varied in terms of kind of what the evaluation looks like. There's no like one size fits all. It's kind of a very bespoke offer, I guess.
I was going to say, what an incredible experience and position for you to land as a postdoc, though.
Yeah.
Because it's really, it makes me think back to what you said in the Rapid 11 about the your power trio that you have around you, and how you're using that power trio. It sounds to me like this role that you've gotten, and some people might argue it's a tangent because it's neither clinical academic or clinical.
No,
it's sort of in this other sort of outside category that probably people don't even know exists. But as a job, it's giving you a real opportunity to really challenge like your thinking around complexity and models, and like having to learn lots of different new methods, techniques, theories. Like, wow, that's incredible.
Yeah. So like for me, like I fell out of my PhD into something that I just didn't really know that I was looking for, but actually has turned out to be this really perfect thing, just to grow what I know and expand where like my horizons in terms of, you do research, you deliver your research, you write up the paper, ta-da. You know, it's then like that next step on about spread and adoption and implementation. So for me, it's really been insightful, because now if I was to think about putting a grant application in, I wouldn't be thinking about just the research question. I'd be thinking about the implementation question, and be thinking about implementation outcomes, but doing those prospectively from the beginning, so that you're not scrabbling around at the end for implementation data to understand why things worked and why things didn't. I'd be going, I can capture this at the start and have a much better picture of how things have gone, and do this in a really formative way, as opposed to just this summative evaluation. So do temperature checks along the way, and do some interim implementation kind of knowledge gathering. So yeah, for me, it's been a really useful tangent and a really interesting one, and and very much an accident, but very interesting.
Now because this being a podcast and me wanting to share your journey and the lessons you've learned with all of the listeners out there around the world to this. So for me, doing my clinical academic PhD, it was always get a clinical academic post, and then you could always fall back on an academic or a clinical post if that magical one didn't come through. So you just said there now that it was an accident. So how did you go, like, how did this accident happen? Like, because I think the truth is around finishing your PhD is there's this huge other category that nobody talks about. And I think your role falls into that other category. So for you, what was the accident and how did you like share how you find these amazing accidents?
I literally was on NHS jobs looking at clinical jobs in the area when we were moving to, and I just put the area plus a certain radius and just searched all jobs. And I was like, oh, interesting.
Okay.
I didn't put like physio or anything. I literally just went into NHS jobs and I was like, this job needs to be kind of within this radius.
Yeah.
See what pops up. And that's literally, and I rang the now director of the team that I'm in and was like, I've seen this job advertised, or like I think I emailed maybe or phoned, I can't remember. Anyway, I had a conversation with her and was like, this sounds really interesting. And so just it was not something I'd kind of foreseen doing at all.
Okay.
And just taking me down a very different route.
Then.
Yeah, and taking me down a very different route. And I'm a massive advocate for clinical academic careers. If that opportunity had been there, kind of on my lap, very easy to navigate, and whilst relocating, I would have jumped at that opportunity. Absolutely, of course I would. But I also had a very realistic head on that trying to navigate 2 part-time roles in an area I hadn't got a reputation or people didn't know me. So how could I say, take a chance on me? So I was really reliant on my old manager putting me in contact with his contacts where we were moving to and all of that sort of stuff. So it was quite hard. So I think, that's why we lose. So for me, the clinical academic career was absolutely where I was going. And it didn't, and obviously hasn't, but do I regret it not happening? Not necessarily. It's just different. And I don't think there's a right and there's a wrong there.
No, I so
think,
agree with you.
And I think it's just like your gut probably tells you whether something feels right or wrong.
I'm so grateful for you sharing all of that because I think like in loads of people that I talk to who are like a little step behind me or just starting their journey and like they're asking questions, because the NIHR are really pushing hard to try and promote and build research capacity in non-medic clinicians right now. And everybody comes to me and talks to me because they know I did this clinical academic PhD and blah, blah, blah. And they're like, do you think it's worth it? And all this other stuff. And I think exactly what you just said is I encourage people to have a realist head because it isn't worked out yet. And there are a few exemplars out there who are starting to create these hybrid roles that are cross-cutting across institutions. So you only have one contract, but you've got the 2 different roles. But those are pretty much as popular as hen's teeth. And I think the reality of it is that most people who pursue or continue in that clinical academic pathway, it's because they're bringing their milk to their own milkshake party through having won an NIHR fellowship or grants or whatever, and they're buying out their time in their NHS contract or whatever, rather than it being I don't know, people talk about it being like this clinical academic career pathway. And personally, I'm like, at the minute, it's more like a little bit of an overgrown jungle trail.
It is really hard to navigate and it's really hard to work out. And I think even just within that, it's hard working out how you would say generically, how much time do you have as an academic? How much time do you have as a clinician? And actually do you mean an academic or do you mean a researcher? And actually there's so many complexities within that that I think everybody's an individual within that journey as well. And actually what works for one person might just be somebody else's idea of absolute nightmare. So I think it's really it's a challenging space it's a challenging space to navigate. You have to be, I think you have to be quite in tune with what you want and what you think you're like, what you think you want to get out of things, and start to look ahead about, well, where am I going? Where do I want to go? Is that where I want to go? Is that going to help me get there? Like, what's the compromise here to actually in the longer term get to where I want to be? And I think, like, if it was handed on a plate, everybody would, it would, but it's, I think it's just
not like that. But I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. I think a lot of people think that that's a bad thing, but I think, like, you wouldn't have landed in the job that you were in and enjoying it and being challenged as much as what you're being challenged as a physiotherapist researcher. And it's not that you're ignoring that other side of you. It's you're bringing that with you, even if you're not seeing a patient every Tuesday now. And I think, it's all part of your greater research training to shape you into, what is the future for Dr. Ruth Barker?
I don't know. Like, I think I've realized I got a skill set that I want to grow and things that I want to learn, as opposed to necessarily it, unlike, I've got interests rather than it being about this is where I'm gonna go. So I've realized I'm really interested in workforce development, capacity and capability, that area. And actually it's not very sexy, and but it's kind of what makes me kind of excited and kind of interested. So I think, for me it's working out what I'm interested in and what makes me excited, and what do I want to do. Like, I do love respiratory physio, and I've got so many respiratory physio, I've got so many rehab questions, and that world is really important to me, hence why I've kept all the links, and I still do lots of still got lots of respiratory connections. I'm part of the, like, American Thoracic Society Pulmonary Rehab Assembly as a chair of one of their committees, so I still do lots of still connected to that world. But it's, for me, like, it's working, it's not about, like, am I going to be a professor or am I going to be a consultant physio? Like, I don't know where I'm going to end up, and I'm kind of reconciled that that's okay. Like, I've got something in my head that I think, I don't know enough about that, go and learn about that. Or actually, if that's what really drives you, go and focus on that and actually learn more about that and get involved in that world and do more on that. So I'm not sure I know where I'm going, but I know that there's things that I don't feel like I know enough about that will guide my next steps, and then I'll see where I guess I am then, which is a bit it's not a very helpful answer if people are wanting answers.
No, I would actually argue the opposite. I think that's probably, like, the most, like, genuine answer to that question I could have ever hoped for, because I think, to me, it fits with everything else that you've said about who you are and how you are going about this development as a researcher. And for you, it's all about the why. It is all about the why. And for you now, you're recognizing what part of that question is important to you, like which why you want to answer, and you're dialing down and you're exploding out on all the different methods and possible ways that you can try and answer a given question. And you're open to opportunity, and eyes are on the horizon, and there's no doubt that things are going to change and alter, and opportunities are going to come to you. And you'll just be able to better direct yourself, because instead of it just being like, ooh, there's a assistant professor job there, I'll go and do that, and then have to learn a whole new set of newness, you're holding on to those things that are core values to you. So that workforce picture and the pulmonary rehab picture. And I would say, actually, those things are so connected, because especially your experience with, you did all of that amazing engagement work and they're like, yes, face to face is the most important. And then like the world erupted and face to face was no longer a possibility. So combining those two things of being like, okay, in an ideal world, yes, if we could, yes. But the reality is we only have one physiotherapist for the entire, this is a specialist in pulmonary rehab for the entire area of Wessex, and he or she cannot be everywhere at once. So what are creative solutions around that match your workforce, that will also answer that need, even if it's a slight tweak to what the patients ideally wanted, but it will still provide that service for them. So I think it's beautiful.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's just, to answer the career question, I think it's keeping open and just figuring it out as you as you go, whilst also kind of having a regular check-in and being like, does this make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, you're a powerful trio.
Yeah.
I've got this vision of like three people around a pot and you're sitting in the pot being stirred.
Yeah. Yeah. My brain just a mash. Yeah.
I'm sure it's not like that. I don't know why. I just have this cartoon vision in my head.
It is far more strategic than that, I think.
I'm fairly certain it is.
Yeah.
From
I think it's a bit more strategic.
I'm pretty sure it is. There's just one of those weird images that pops into your head. I'm just conscious of the time, and it has flown by, Ruth. I always give this opportunity. Is there, other than what you've just said, which I think actually is perfect, anything else that you'd like to share, or, inspire other physiotherapists like you out there to, try out your gateway drug of choice?
Yeah. Just be curious. Just don't be afraid to ask a question that you're not sure whether or not you can answer. And just test things. See where the questions take you. It's an interesting world once you get into it.
Definitely. I think that's beautiful advice. I'm going to wrap things up here. For everybody, if this might be your first time listening to it, the podcast, in the episode description on either your podcasting platform of choice or on YouTube, we'll put in where you can find Ruth on her socials. And as well, we'll list a couple of her publications so that you can kind of get a taste for some of the research that she's doing, as well as some other details in there. So definitely check that out. Remember to subscribe and like, and if you have any questions at all, whether it's for me or for Ruth, just leave them in the comments on YouTube, because that's sort of like the central place and easiest for us to find them and answer them. And other than that, thank you so much for listening, and we will see you in another 3 weeks for the next episode of Researcher Revealed. Thanks so much. Bye. Don't go away. Up next, we have the top 3 takeaways from this week's podcast by Dr. Rosalind Austin. I know I say this after every episode, but I think it just goes to speak with how much I really am enjoying doing this podcast for all of you out there. Ruth was, I'm so grateful that she agreed to take part and be a guest on the podcast. I knew her through on Facebook. There's a group which we're going to have a podcast about later on, called the Hyper Healthcare Professionals Research Group. And I knew her through there, and we'd done some other things together through that. So I was keen to have her on to share her experience. And she was great. I learned much more about her and her journey than I did, even though we've known each other for several years now. And she had some really good insight that I'm going to now list as my top 3 takeaways for this week's episode. So, number 1 is curiosity. And I've said that a couple of times, is just ask why. But, and she was saying the same, that, her curiosity kept leading her to ask why about various different clinical things. And I thought it was really interesting because for her, she talked about how that curiosity, how research became the playground for that curiosity. And she talked about how in the clinical world, and this is true, that often asking why we do something can not be always that welcome. And so for her, that transition into research was smoother because she was now being encouraged to ask why, and not just ask that question why, but try and find out the answer to the question. So that was a really interesting take, that it was research became that safe space for her to expand her curiosity. So yeah, it was a really, really new way of thinking about that for me. Second, and we kept using the term through the podcast, and it made me giggle so much, was her gateway drug. Yeah, gateway drug. Anyway, not an actual drug, but she was using the term as being like those initial activities that she was doing as a clinician, being audit and quality improvement work. For her, that became her gateway into research, and it taught her a lot of those initial research skills around structuring something, data analysis, data collection, and coming through and coming up with a conclusion. And again, she kept saying that it was giving her space for that curiosity to grow and expand, and those skills around curiosity to grow and expand. And that was interesting. And I asked her specifically, because we've had lots of other guests on the podcast talk about how for them, their gateway drug was research delivery. And for her, it was very different. It was actually through those clinical evaluations, that real world evaluation, that actually facilitated that journey into research. So I found that really, really interesting. And then the third is bit tricky, because we've both done clinical academics, and like I said, we're in this group where it's a national group here in the UK, and we all talk about, and actually I think it's international now as well, but we all talk about the challenges that we're having as healthcare professionals in embedding research into our careers. And in the UK, we use this term of clinical academic, and it was sort of coined back in 2009 of being this umbrella concept of an individual who would both work clinically and academically. But what that academic piece was up for discussion. And some people choose to view that as being a researcher. Other people think about that as becoming a lecturer, but those two different components. And so going through our clinical academic PhDs, I can remember at the time, both her and I, as well as others, you're pursuing this role, this dual role that would allow you to do research but stay clinical, which would mean two different contracts and two different institutions. And those positions, they're primarily, aside from a couple of exceptions, and we had one of the exceptions on an earlier podcast, Dr. Lindsay Welch. I'll link it in the description so you can re-listen to that, because she actually has a true clinical academic position where she has both clinical and academic, but instead of being two contracts, they've actually managed to umbrella it under a single one. And when we as PhDs, when we were looking and thinking about finishing our PhDs and what our next steps were, we were all pursuing this clinical academic post. And I think her description of the job that she's in now and the role that she has and what it's allowing and facilitating her to grow in her skill set is just, I think, top takeaway is keep your eyes on the horizon. Is although you might think that this one thing is for you, that there might be other things that pop up and opportunities that pop up that might actually be better suited for who you are, where you are, and may grow your career in a different way than you'd originally thought. But that may not necessarily be a bad thing. There's lots of opportunities in order for you to use your research skills out there. And so it's just about, keeping your eye on the horizon for those opportunities and carrying through to those opportunities, those core values in you. So for Ruth, it was, you know, her emerging core value, not just about her pulmonary rehabilitation, but around those workforce issues and how those two things intersect when it comes towards implementing a new program of care for a given patient population. So I think that's it. Top 3 takeaways. So curiosity, which isn't a new one. It's a repeating theme. The gateway drug being introduced to research through audits and through QI work clinically, and then to keep your eyes on the horizons for any opportunities out there that will allow you to pursue that thing that you're very, very passionate about. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening and sticking all the way to the end to hear my top 3 takeaways. I'm really grateful for everybody out there who's subscribed, who's liked, who's commenting on the posts, and for those of you who've left a review on your podcasting platform of choice. I'm really, really grateful for those stars. Thank you very, very much. Next episode will be coming in 3 weeks. So if you haven't already, make sure you hit the subscribe button. Give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed the episode, and I will see you again in 3 weeks. Thanks so much for listening, and keep asking why.